Bene, benvenuti a questo altro incontro con un altro grande autore e un amico di Ludostoria, David Thompson. Hi David, hello.
Hey, thanks for having me.
David è l'autore, è inutile che lo presento, it's almost useless to introduce you, è l'autore di giochi come Undaunted, come General Orders, Pavlo's House, the Europe Divided. You made a lot of stuff and you have a great experience, I think, as an innovative game designer and of course, but also as a designer, we really pushed forward the boundaries of what historical simulation and simulation in general is. You also have a lot of fantasy titles like War Chest, for example, but they're all simulation games. David è sempre stato un autore che ha sempre spinto in avanti i confini della simulazione e questo è qualcosa di molto molto interessante. Quest'oggi noi cominciamo con una piccola chiacchierata all'inizio su David, la sua carriera e il suo approccio e poi ci porterà una grande anteprima. We will have first a brief talk about you, your career, your game design approach, and then you will show us a preview, a great preview of the latest title you're working on. So, David, just to begin with, mm, my my own impression when I get to know one of your games, when I got to play one of your games, is that well, this is something different. It is simulation, but it really does not resemble anything I've ever played. So, how did you start and why did you choose this particular approach? Come è cominciato questo suo approccio sempre diverso, completamente, totalmente diverso rispetto alla simulazione tradizionale e perché? Why do you design games the way that you design them?
I think some of it is definitely the path that led me to historical games. I came to game design. I came to gaming, board gaming,
Mm-hmm.
through role playing games. I
Okay.
grew up playing role playing games. Um, I did not start playing board games until probably about 10, 15 years ago. Um, And so I think that path was a little bit unusual. And the first board games I started playing were not war games. And so I think a lot of that influence from other types of games can be seen on some of my war game designs.
Quindi in pratica l'inizio è stato un po' più vicino al gioco di ruolo, quindi anche il gioco narrativo, e in effetti è partito da lì per arrivare poi al gioco della simulazione storica. E con il suo approccio particolare. What would you define as the main features of your approach to game design? Quali sono le
Yeah, I
caratteristiche
think,
principali? Ecco.
yeah, sorry. I think when I'm looking to, and it really depends on the game I'm designing. So you can have games that are just not historical at all. Like you said, War Chest, it's an
Mhm.
abstract game. Or you can have something like Undaunted, which is inspired by historical events, but not based on something specific. And then you can have games that are very, very particularly inspired by very specific events, like Pavlov's House or like By Stealth and Sea. And so it depends on which of those types of games that I'm working on. But no matter what, when I start working on a game, I do all of the sort of research and
Mhm.
background historical material first before the design begins. And then I construct a model, and it's not really a simulation, it's really more of a model that's aimed at focusing on the heart of what I want the game to be about.
Mm.
And it might not be the totality of the battle. It might be a very focused, specific piece of it that I want the game to really communicate.
So, a very focused approach, un approccio molto focalizzato ad un singolo elemento dell'evento, per quanto con tutto il rigore storico, però. molto molto focalizzato. Questo, well, this is interesting because somehow when you design games with your approach, it looks like a bit abstract, a bit streamlined and effect design, effect oriented, etc. We have a lot of possible. It might seem that, well, it is nice, but it is not so accurate. In fact, you are very focused. Uh, I I always remember one of your phrases in your design notes for Undaunted. This is not a simulationist game. And I really like that phrase because it is not just simulation for simulation's sake. It is you want to tell a story. Vuole raccontare una storia con il gioco. You want to tell stories with your games.
Mm. Yeah, I always there's always something that I really want the player to come away with after they've played the game, and it depends on the game. Each one's different about what I want that to feel like. With Undaunted, it was what does it feel like to lead a platoon and all the stresses you get from that, right? Not
Also
trying to
from
tell an
the
individual
personal
battle.
stories of some of your family members. Cioè, cosa significa raccontare un potere anche con le storie di membri della sua famiglia? Because you had your grandfather, I think, was in that division, or the Infantry division.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's very much, it's almost always, almost all of my games are at that personal level, right? And it's about telling the stories of those people and then just trying to find what individual aspect of that story I want to tell.
Postman in soldier's uniform is almost plays like a Greek tragedy. I have to tell you, I sometimes I do not have the stomach to leave that because every single counter, you know that he is going to die, to be prisoner of the Germans. It is about the Polish resistance in the very first hours of World War II. But they do that to save other people. I know only one designer who has made something like that, and that designer is Brian Train with the Knights of Fire. That we translating now, il fatto, questo suo approccio, l'approccio di David al design degli individui, delle storie personali nell'ambito della storia, significa che hai dei giochi ad altissimo impatto emotivo. Soldiers in Postman Uniforms, che è un gioco sulle primissime ore di resistenza dei polacchi durante la seconda guerra mondiale. Praticamente ogni segnalino sai che sarà ucciso o finirà prigioniero. Ed è veramente un colpo allo stomaco notevole. Però è anche questo un approccio gioco storico, è anche questo un approccio fondamentale, importantissimo alla storia. But you do not always tell just individual stories. Non fa sempre storie individuali, come anche stato alcuni membri della sua famiglia che ritrovate negli scenari noted. But you also use your professional expertise. I am speaking about Europe Divided, which is a game that maybe it is about an outdated situation now that everything is changing in the European Union and the US and Russia, etc. All right, the international situation here, but it really comes from your own professional expertise. So, which elements of your professional expertise come into play in your game design approach? Just one moment, translating. Siccome poi dopo ha fatto anche giochi che sono meno personalistici ma sono più dei modelli, come per esempio Europe Divided, che è sulla situazione in Europa, Russia, America, Unione Europea, eccetera, quali elementi, grazie al suo lavoro appunto di analista e appunto quali elementi professionali entrano nel suo game design? Come on.
Yeah, so it's interesting. But so for my day job, I work for the Department of Defense as an intelligence officer. And so what that really means is I usually stay away from topics that are modern topics that touch that area because it's so much work to have a game that's set in modern times that can be related to my job approved for release. So I have to go through the process of doing that. So Europe Divided, when I finished working on it, it was around the time that the game goes up through, which is 2019, 2020. And so I had to be very careful to make sure that all the material in the game is completely open information, accessible to anybody,
Because they
so that
are
it was no
professional
problem.
models that you used in that game.
Right. Yeah. So the model is very much, I mean, obviously the model itself is, there's no concern about, but the information can't be in any way classified or, be, so I have to be very careful from that regard. Now, when it comes to using models, that's something I do in my day job, obviously. So there's a lot of taking the concept of deconstructing a complex topic into a model from my day job and applying that to whatever game I'm working on. But in general, I stay away from modern topics just because it's so difficult to navigate that process of releasing it.
David lavora come intelligence officer, quindi come analista di informazioni per il Dipartimento della Difesa americano, e quindi anche quando fa un gioco come Europe Divided, uno dei motivi per cui cerca di, insomma, difficilmente troverete giochi troppo sugli aspetti moderni, è che ovviamente deve utilizzare informazioni che magari possono avere diversi livelli di classificazione. Il modello no, però il modello è un modello in quanto tale. I am really interested in the fact that you said I have to reduce events and dynamics into models. This is very Dunnigan because it is very. It said a simulation is a model that is playable. So you take events, you reduce them to models, to interactive models, and then you make those models playables, and those are simulation games. Praticamente fa un lavoro alla Dunnigan, prende gli eventi, li riduce a modelli, rende i modelli interattivi e giocabili, e quindi in giochi di simulazione. Questo è Dunnigan. So you will define your process like that, even for historical events. You take an event, you get that to a model. So how does this translate into games?
Oh, that's a good question. The easiest thing to do is think about it in terms of an example, like Lanzareth Ridge, which is set during the Battle of the Bulge. If you look at the model I used for other games in the Valiant Defense series, like Pavlov's House or Castle Itter, there's some similarities, obviously, because there are some similarities in the system, but there's choices that have to be made in the model. So, for example, in Lanzareth Ridge, you have a single platoon defending a location, and the key enabler for them to hold out successfully was the heavy weapons they had, the machine guns.
Okay.
And ammunition was a finite resource.
The ammo cycle, you get ammunition from the trucks to the MG.
Exactly, and so the limited ammunition didn't play a role in the other games, but it was a critical role in this one. And so during the research process, when that was identified, I knew that for the first time, that system had to be able to support the concept of tracking ammunition. Right? And so the trick is, how do you incorporate something that important into the model without the game becoming cumbersome, tedious? I didn't want too much chrome in it. And so it's always
keeping about, okay, I spent one ammo and I have 10
exactly.
Hours, okay.
Yeah, it's exactly. And so it's a matter of balancing. This is important. It needs to be represented in the game. But at the same time, I don't want the game to be weighed down because of that, at addition to the model. But each of those choices has to be weighed individually and decide, is it important enough to include for the story you're telling in the game?
In another meeting during this day with two friends that are game designers, Sergio Fabra and Aldo Ghetti, I said that the work of a game designer is a bit like a movie director in the editing room and says, this scene is important, no, ok, this other we cut out. È un po', il discorso è questo: quando vai a fare queste riduzioni naturalmente devi scegliere cosa tenere e cosa no. Per esempio in Lanzarote Ridge si dice era fondamentale per me rappresentare, perché questo momento, this is a moment a single platoon, a single signal platoon, I think, almost stalled the entire battle, the Belgian Northern Front, in cui praticamente un singolo plotone di gente che stava lì, di gente delle segnalazioni, ha quasi da solo fermato un intero pezzo dell'offensiva delle Ardenne. Però ecco, in questo era fondamentale nel modello rappresentare il fatto che loro avevano un'arma pesante e gli portavano le munizioni. Bene, cosa rappresentiamo? Rappresentiamo il fatto, tutto il ciclo di sparo munizioni, c'è qualcun altro che me lo porta da dietro, io lo carico, lo sparo, eccetera. Non posso perdere troppo tempo nel record keeping, sto sempre lì a segnare cosa è stato utilizzato e cosa no. Ok, oh, Randall's got a very interesting question on models. What if a situation is not really balanced? Cosa succede se una situazione non è bilanciata? Realize there is no turn taking. How do you proceed about modeling such imbalances to achieve a fun and playable game? Bonus question: if you want to have, how can you remove your own personal biases in asserting a situational model balance? Just one moment, I'm translating. Come facciamo a gestire una situazione in questo, tutto questo riduzione a modello, una situazione che è sbilanciata, perché la vita vera è sbilanciata, come la manteniamo divertente e giocabile, e poi come, alla faccia della domanda, come si rimuovono i biases, le distorsioni personali, le imprecisioni personali, anche un po' le proprie inclinazioni quando si valuta una situazione. David, this is a good question.
Yeah, this is a good one. So there's a few different methods to do this. Obviously, one method, of course, is you can if you, let's say you have a battle and the battle is unbalanced, a historical battle. One thing is to just take a part of that battle, right? Just zoom into a part that might be more balanced, or you're just capturing a small portion of it. So that would be one option. Another option, obviously, is a very gamey option where you give a different victory condition than the actual historical goal, right? And that's an achievable goal. It's a balanced goal. You'll see that in like Battle of the Bulge games where the Germans will have a goal that's not the actual historic.
We have the Caporetto syndrome. How do you simulate Caporetto? And we spoke about that. Okay, the battle was lost from the beginning. What is the good? Our friend Enrico Acerbi has made a lot of research for his Dirkbrook game, and the problem is, and he highlighted that, how do we make good victory conditions in a situation like that?
Yeah. Now my personal approach is often that can be the reason to make a game a solitaire game. And so we'll go back to the Lanzareth Ridge scenario. So historically, the actual historic situation was extremely unbalanced because the Germans should have overrun the INR platoon instantly. You have, 500 a 500 unit or person German unit that was held up by 20 guys, and so it should have been an overwhelming victory for the Germans immediately if the leadership had been competent at all. And this is a little bit of a slightly different question and answer because it's not an unbalanced situation. It was actually a balanced situation. It shouldn't have been. Historically, it shouldn't have been. And so how do you recreate that? And then, if you're doing it, and there is for example, there is a combat commander scenario about Lanzareth Ridge. Now, I haven't looked too closely into it, but I have no idea. You really have to hamstring the Germans to have a 2-player experience that works out like it did historically.
That is playable.
But, yeah. Right, because you're asking the German player to either have some weird handicap or to play stupidly. And so, but that can be a really good reason to have a solitaire game because you can have the Germans limited by an AI that reflects what they did historically. So a few different approaches you can take.
Il problema è questo, chiaramente gli approcci devono essere diversi. La cosa classica è che giochi sulle condizioni di vittoria. Le sbilanci, quindi dici il giocatore che è avvantaggiato ha delle condizioni di vittoria più difficili dell'altro, deve ottenere di più rispetto a quello che ottiene storicamente. Un altro approccio è quello che ha utilizzato David con Lazarus Ridge. Fai un gioco in solitario. Also, Herman Latman used this approach in his own new Caporetto title that I've seen. Anche Herman Latman ha fatto adesso un gioco su Caporetto in solitario, ovviamente dalla parte degli austro-tedeschi. È chiaro, perché a questo punto devi fare questo. Però ci sono diverse possibilità. È chiaro che in un gioco in solitario tu puoi dare un bot svantaggiato e a quel punto non vai a rovinare un'esperienza per due giocatori bloccando uno dei due giocatori e dandogli un handicap troppo forte. Luciano Fornaciari has another question for you. Do you think that, well, I have something of an answer because I know something is in the work there, but general orders, they really like as a game, and as I told you, General Orders gave me the feeling that I was an officer cadet in a training room and having an abstract training exercise that is very, however, that is very also reminiscent of some of the dynamics in World War II, especially the Pacific scenario. But can we expect General Orders mechanics to be transferred to other historical periods, and also, but not just other historical periods, because I know there is a Sengoku Jedi game in the works, but with larger and richer scenarios? Well, making it a bigger game. Do you think that the system, the general order system, can be translated to bigger games? Pensa che appunto il sistema di General Orders possa essere utilizzato non solo per altri periodi storici, perché c'è Sengoku Jidai in arrivo, ma più grandi.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, this summer the second game in the series will come out, and what's fun about that one, obviously, it introduces some new choices, and it reflects the history more, obviously. But when you play General Orders, one of the two sides of the board on the World War II is a purely symmetric. Intentionally, it's a purely symmetric board, and it's a sort of introduction.
Scenario. Yeah,
the Alpine scenario. That's right. And so what that means is, we're obviously not going to recreate that symmetric board again with the follow-on. So the next game in the series, both boards will have new things and they'll be asymmetric. So I think that, if somebody's coming to that from World War II, they're going to see, okay, well, there's sort of twice as much new content from an asymmetric and new stuff, right, perspective. So I think people will like that. So that's one part of the question. Now, in terms of making it bigger, the actual origin for the game General Orders came from my desire to make a game about the Battle of Mortain. So if people don't know, the Battle of Mortain was a counterattack by the Germans during World War II, and I chose that because
after D-Day in Normandy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it was close to the breakout, right? And so the Germans were trying to stop the breakout and basically break through. It was a major German counter-attempt offensive.
Just after Cobra.
And so yes, just after Cobra, that's right. And of course, the reason I knew about it and I had visited Mortain was because, once again, that was the 30th Infantry Division, so the same unit that's in Undaunted Normandy. And so I wanted to design a game where you were basically the commander of the 30th Infantry Division, and you were managing supply lines, and you were, coordinating artillery and coordinating air defenses and all of those things. And I kept thinking that a worker placement game would allow you to do that sort of like high level orchestration of commands. And so that was the origin of General Orders. And then through working with my co-design partner and working through Osprey, we just sort of made it more and more abstract. And so when you play it and you see the importance of supply lines and you see the importance of artillery, those are echoes back to that same, origin of basing it on the Battle of Mortain. That was a really long way of saying that. Yes, absolutely. I think you could translate it into a more literal version of a bigger or more historical
Ok,
conflict.
great. Allora, due notizie interessantissime. Primo, il gioco su Sengoku Jidai avrà entrambe le board, lati della board asimmetrici, quindi ci sarà più asimmetria rispetto alla un po' introduttivo scenario della simmetria totale di uno dei due scenari General Holders. Quindi sì, assolutamente avremo maggiore asimmetria. Ma la seconda cosa è che il sistema è nato per rappresentare la controffensiva tedesca di Mortain, che c'è anche in Undaunted, aggiungo io, e appunto era nato più grande, poi dopo mano a mano è stato ridotto e riportato a quelle dimensioni. Quindi assolutamente sì, c'è lo spazio, perché no? Why not? A future title would be great about it, because we have the basis, abbiamo la struttura, abbiamo le basi per farlo. Quindi, fra l'altro, una cosa interessante, David ci ha detto, lavorando a Morten ha capito che questo aspetto particolare, la gestione delle risorse, dell'artiglieria, dei rifornimenti, andava molto bene con delle meccaniche di worker placement. This reminds me of a game that we brought as Ludo Storia in the last play when it was in Modena, that was Race to the Rhine, Keep and Rolling, that uses resource management, a typically Euro approach, and it is a fantastic that game by Yves Roy, because you have one half of a game that is a typical German game where you are moving stuff and it's almost a pick up and delivery, and but and the other half is a war game, is a true war game, because I'm moving units around and fighting with the resources I brought there, thanks to a typical Euro game, and that is why I remember when I asked Mark Eman, and we will meet Mark Eman next week here in Rome, and I said during the live, well, what do you think about this new influx of Eurogame mechanics into historical simulation? And he very candidly answered me, well, I don't know wargame mechanics and Eurogame mechanics. I only know good or bad mechanics at translating.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, e il fatto questo mi ricorda una domanda che ho fatto a Mark Herman, che incontreremo settimana prossima qui a Roma, con Ergoludo, l'elemento Ergoludo GMT, e quando gli chiesi ma che cosa ne pensi di tutte quante queste belle meccaniche Eurogame che entrano nei wargame nella simulazione, mi ha risposto: io non conosco meccaniche da Eurogame o da wargame, conosco meccaniche che sono efficaci o non efficaci nel rappresentare la storia. Un'altra domanda, another question, con tutta quanta questa storia individuale, se hai scoperto delle cose nuove, dei nuovi punti di vista sugli eventi su cui hai lavorato come game designer. If you discovered what you new stuff about historical events you were depicting as a game designer using these unconventional approaches. We had in an earlier meeting, we spoke about the great stuff of being an historical game designer is also discovering things about those events. And if your personal, very peculiar, very individual, narrative-oriented approach to historical research and historical game design has led you to discover new facets of well-known events. For example, Lanzaret Ridge is an amazing story. It is beyond the heroism. But also I remember Castellita, when you the Gaulle's sister with General Weygand and the former tennis player. It almost looked like a comedy movie, but it is true. It is all true. And with German soldiers fighting against German SS. It's amazing. Did you have these episodes of discovering new facets of history?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I could probably give you an example for every one, but the most significant, for sure, was when I was researching Pavlov's house. So, Pavlov's house, yeah. So when, I created Castle Itter before I created Pavlov's house, and after I had finished the design for Castle Itter, I posted on Board Game Geek and I said, hey, what does anyone have any ideas for another point defense, static defense like Castle Litter? Did anybody have any ideas? And somebody pointed out Pavlov's House. And so,
Because
of course, I knew a
Castle
little bit
was
about it.
before Pavlov's House.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so, of course, I knew a little bit about Pavlov's House. But if you just know the high level narrative about it, you'll hear that, this unit of Soviet soldiers held out for a couple of months against all odds. That's the story you're told. And if you start to dig a little deeper, it's hard to get to the real story. And the real story is it wasn't just a handful of Soviet soldiers by themselves defending it for 2 months. It was a much more robust, elaborate defensive effort that allowed that to happen. And so the actual, not only did I learn it, but the design changed. It went from being a game that was very similar in scope to Castle Litter to a much more, larger, more expansive design that included the operational elements that allowed that defense to exist.
I have to tell you, it is genius, pure genius. I really love that. I never seen that in a game with 3 different segments. Just one moment, I'm just letting your answer. Appunto sì, e come ovviamente ci sono stati questi episodi di scoperta. Per esempio, uno è Pavlov's House. Pochi lo sanno perché avranno visto l'uscita delle pubblicazioni, ma Pavlov's House arriva dopo Castle Litter. You proposed that to Victory Point Games, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Okay. Il primo fu una proposta di Castle Litter alla Victory Point Games, quindi Castle Litter è precedente a Pavlov's House, si vede anche perché è un po' meno elaborato. Dopo David va su Board Game Geek, fa un post, qualcuno conosce un'altra situazione tipo questa e gli propongono Pavlov's House. Bene, il condominio Pavlov ha questi soldati russi che teoricamente resistettero per tante settimane ai continui attacchi tedeschi e scopre che non sono isolati. Loro vanno lì, c'è una rotazione, c'è un arrivo di rinforzi, c'è un appoggio che lo collega a tutta quanta la battaglia di Stalingrado, con quello che vediamo i 3 livelli bellissimi di Pavlov's House, che è la casa, quindi l'interno della casa, l'esterno della casa e poi tutta Stalingrado, e anche tutto lo sforzo logistico per continuare a mandare persone e munizioni a Pavlov's House. Ok, se non abbiamo altre domande io andrei alla dimostrazione di gioco. If you have no other questions, I would like to go straight to the preview of your next game, that is Rebels Against Rebellion. So you want to give us a general introduction to the game?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just share my screen for a second, and I want to bring up a couple of slides that I have that I'll show as I'm talking about this, because I know some people might not be familiar with the Civil War or the specific state that I want to discuss.
Una breve presentazione con un paio di slide sul gioco Rebels Against Rebellion, che è l'anteprima che ci sta portando David. Ok, go on, please.
So Rebels Against Rebellion is a game. It's an American Civil War game, which is something I never thought I would make. I of course I grew up in the American South. So when you grow up in the South, you know a lot about it, mostly on the Confederate side.
Okay.
There's still quite a bit by many people that live in the South, there's still quite a bit of almost reverence for the Confederacy.
You are from which state?
Georgia.
Georgia. Okay, right.
Georgia. Yeah. So there's almost, this may seem strange, but there's almost a bit of what I would call reverence still for the South, or a positive, view of the Confederate Army. You'll hear, and actually Fred Serval's podcast, We Intend. Yeah, it's done a great job talking about things like the Lost Cause narrative and things like that. And so, this game was inspired by that podcast. I love that podcast. I've been listening to it, and I wanted to explore sort of a counter narrative to the Lost Cause narrative.
Just a minute, short
Yeah, go ahead.
translation.
Sorry.
David viene dalla Georgia, quello stato che vedete con GA, e ovviamente essendo uno degli stati del sud, lì la guerra civile è molto sentita, c'è anche un certo tipo di ricordo della guerra civile, e l'idea del gioco gli è venuta ascoltando un podcast di Fred Servale e altri sui giochi della guerra civile e come questi giochi, qual è il loro rapporto con una corrente della storiografia, non direi revisionista, ma quantomeno diciamo che dà anche una certa visione della guerra civile, che è quella della lost cause, cioè della causa persa. E quindi è questo tipo di questo podcast che ha ispirato David per narrare la guerra civile dalla parte del sud, ma dalla parte di un sud diverso dalla Confederazione. You are essentially narrating the Civil War from a southern point of view, but from a different south than the one that we are used
Right.
to. Okay.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so Rebels Against Rebellion is really telling the story of the people from the South who maintained loyalty to the Union. And there was a lot of that happened in many different places, and for many different reasons, right? So sometimes there were noble reasons, like genuinely opposing slavery.
Okay.
And then sometimes there were reasons that were more self-serving, like, there were many people in the South who they didn't really care about slavery one way or the other because economically it didn't affect them, right? And economically they were better off by working with the Union than they were with the Confederacy.
Okay.
And
also,
this,
if I remember well, West Virginia essentially was created exactly for this reason after Virginia seceded.
That's right. Yes,
Okay.
West Virginia. Basically, West Virginia is probably the best known example of this, where you have a large enough group that was opposed to secession to themselves break apart as their own
Abbiamo
state.
il caso della West Virginia, che è un pezzo della Virginia che se n'è andata dalla Virginia dopo che la Virginia ha fatto la secessione. Naturalmente non sempre chi era contro la secessione del sud aveva questi spiriti nobili, anche semplicemente non gli interessava o economicamente stava meglio con il nord. But we have a very special situation about Tennessee, as I am seeing.
Yes, so it's interesting because if you look at Eastern Tennessee is part of that Appalachian Mountain area. And if you think that there's a region of the U.S., it's called Appalachia, and so it's sort of that Eastern Tennessee, it goes up into West Virginia, and so that whole region, they really, there was not much slavery because there was no opportunity for crops that slaves would
There were no large plantations, etc.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Right. So you have a region of area where there really just wasn't slavery, and the people were largely pro-union, and so that area of Tennessee is where the game is set, and so it's one specific county in Tennessee where it was overwhelming. So that when the vote for secession occurred, and I've got the numbers here up in the slide.
wow.
You can see that Scott County, it was essentially every single person in the county voted against secession.
93%. Qui abbiamo un esempio di una contea 93% contro la secessione. Amazing.
Right. And so what happens is you set the stage for this county to try to secede from Tennessee. They claim they seceded. Of course, the Confederacy, Tennessee doesn't recognize that. But you have a very hilly area, or almost mountainous area, heavily wooded, sparsely populated. So it's very difficult for the Confederate Army to come in and put down any sort of rebellion. And so not only is the terrain not really good for it, but you have the Confederate Army that really needs to be doing other things. This is near Cumberland Gap, so they need to be doing other military operations. They shouldn't be.
It is near Chickamauga and Chattanooga, so the sites of the greatest battles of the Civil War in the West, and they
Right.
were tied
Yes.
down in actions against those
That
loyalists.
that's right. And so essentially, what you have is guerrilla warfare. It's guerrilla warfare on both sides. Very, very little actual Union military action taking place. There
Mm-hmm.
was one unit, I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. There was one unit that stood up for a few months,
Okay.
but that was really it. And it was all built from a home guard. And then on the Confederate side, you do have Confederate aligned militia and guerrilla groups that actually do collaborate with regular Confederate army trying to fight against these Union
Great.
guerrillas.
E quindi abbiamo delle azioni di guerriglia e controguerriglia da parte dei confederati contro i cittadini di queste contee del Tennessee che sono contrariamente contro la secessione. Tra l'altro, molte truppe confederate che vengono bloccate in queste azioni di controguerriglia. Nel frattempo c'è una cosa chiamata guerra civile con le grandi battaglie di Chickamauga, Chattanooga, eccetera. Quindi è un teatro fondamentale. All right, go on, please.
So, and this is the only other slide I'll show, and then I'll actually
Mm-hmm.
show the game. But this is just a quick timeline. So
Okay.
basically, the game focuses on the point where the county seceded, and it goes through 63 when Burnside marched through and basically captured it, and at that point, or liberated it, and at that point, the guerrilla warfare in this county ended, and so that's the period of time you'll play in the game. Now, I've included this timeline, as you know. When I do games that are really focused on historical events, I like to write a companion book, and I've already written the
Yeah,
book for this
they
game.
were the amazing companion books. The one about Pavlos and by Stealth and Sea, and also we want you to give a salutation to Nicola Saggini that helped you in by Stealth and Sea, and the historical research was nothing short of amazing.
And that was all his work, really. I mean, I helped, of course, with the maps and some of the research, but the historic book for that and the historic accuracy is
Mhm.
all of Nicola's work. He was amazing to partner with.
E
A
ricordiamo,
fantastic, both
es- es-
historian and game designer.
ricordiamo Nicola Saggini che ha aiutato David nella ricerca storica per By Stealth and Sea, che è sugli attacchi dei siluri umani, dei maiali, della Mas italiani, porto di Alessandria durante la seconda guerra mondiale. Una delle caratteristiche del lavoro di David sono i meravigliosi compendi storici che lui mette vicino ai giochi. Ok, and so we have this timeline of the events.
Yeah, uh, yeah. Actually, if you'll indulge me,
Yeah,
I've noticed that one of the people in the audience is Ian Brody, who
yeah.
um, Quartermaster General was one of the first war games I ever played, and it's really one of the reasons that I became interested in war game design. So
Mhm.
I've never met Ian in person, so I just wanted to mention that.
Oh, fantastic. You're meeting now. Great.
So okay, so on this timeline, I won't go into a lot of detail. Like I said, anybody that's interested, you can look at the companion book with the game. But one thing that really came to light when I was designing this game was, as you know, I really like digging deeply into the personal level of the stories, and that's reflected in almost all of the games that I've worked on. And this game gave me the opportunity to do that. So because it is sort of a zoomed in guerrilla warfare in this very sparsely populated county, when I started doing all the historic research, I traveled down there. I wanted to walk on sort of the paths where these battles were
Mhm.
taking place. And unlike most Civil War battles, these battles that take place in this game, we're talking like 20 people fighting, 20, 30
Oh, very
people. I mean, they
small
are very
battles.
small
Sono
engagements, right?
tutti
Um,
piccolissimi scontri di 20-30 persone ciascuno. E lui li ha fatto ricerca andando proprio in quei posti, delle micro scaramucce, almost mini skirmishes. Ok.
Very minor skirmishes, very minor. There was really one battle, one proper
Mhm.
battle. And that was kind of it. Almost all of the rest of it were skirmishes along creeks and in at homesteads. But what it
Ok.
gave me the chance to do was individual people made significant impact. And these are not the typical generals that you'll see. And so, for example, in the timeline, you see September 7th in 1861 attack on the Markham home. And so we have here an example of there was a Union soldier. He volunteered for the soldier. He was in the home guard for the county. And the other thing he was is a pilot. And by pilot, I mean he would secretly help soldiers in Tennessee escape to the north and fight in the Union. And so he was a known guy. And so the Confederate military sent some of their soldiers to his house. And this was pretty common. They would try to find these people. They would come to their house. They would capture them or kill them. Mm-hmm. And in this case, so and the other thing, the soldiers knew that, and so they would go into hiding. Well, the Confederate soldiers came to his house. They were looking for them. They were kind of being abusive with the women that were there, his daughters, his wife, and one of his daughters fought back. So she took an axe to a guy. One of the soldiers, she killed him. She lost an eye because he bayoneted her in the eye. He shot off a couple of her fingers, but I include her here because of her actions, she was one of the only women who actually got a military pension after the war was over for her acts during this conflict.
May I said that a true Tennessee girl, a true Tennessee
girl. Tennessee girl. That's right. That's right. That's right. But she's represented in. She's represented in the game.
È rappresentata quella ragazza, vedete, questa è il 7 settembre, perché ovviamente li conoscevano uno per uno, magari erano parenti, quindi vanno nelle loro case a cercare di catturarli, trovano magari la moglie, le figlie, provano ad aggredirle, e questo è il caso di una ragazza che ha preso un'accetta, ha cominciato ad prendere accettate i soldati sudisti, si è presa una baionettata nell'occhio, è stata ferita, eccetera. E questa ragazza è una delle poche donne ad aver avuto una pensione militare dopo la guerra per le sue azioni. But great stories, up close and personal, really.
Right. And it's because of that zoomed in scale that allows you to really explore these personal stories, which is something I don't think you get in many American Civil War games, and you certainly don't get to explore the stories of common people like this and the contributions they made.
You have great battles, Titanic engagements, but you don't get individuals, and now you get them in games like that.
Right. Yeah. And the only other thing I'll mention on the timeline is you'll see on June 1st in 1862. Mm-hmm. The 7th Tennessee Volunteers is established, okay. And so this is the only actual Union military unit that fought. And what it was the home guard of the county was turned into a infantry regiment for a couple of months. Mm-hmm. There was efforts to try to train these soldiers, and then, of course, the Confederates heard about this, and they marched on the town. They went to the county seat, which was a little tiny town called Huntsville, and they attacked a makeshift fort there. And really, that battle where the Confederate military attacked this fort was the only what you would call a battle. And so you're talking about, a few hundred people on each side fighting, and they essentially wiped out the Union regiment at that point.
Okay.
The soldiers were already home guard, so of course, as soon as the regiment was wiped out, they went back to being a home guard and fighting militia conflicts. So they went back doing the exact same thing as guerrillas that they were doing before. But I thought I would just mention it. That was the only real sizable, unit force.
Ci sta parlando David di uno dei pochi scontri su larga scala, vinto in questo caso dai sudisti, anche con delle unità della Home Guard nordista. Ci sono anche delle unità nordiste che intervengono, ma qui il focus è proprio sui cittadini della contea e le loro azioni di guerriglia. This is a very guerrilla-oriented, also counter-insurrection and counter-restoration game, this one.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Danielle. You mentioned at the start that the Confederacy had to send troops, dovete mandare delle truppe e che quindi furono distratte da altri fronti. Molto interessante. Which do you think was the impact in the main conflict? What do you think the impact of this particular story to the greater conflict? Quale, secondo David, è stato l'impatto di questa storia specifica sul grande scenario? On the big scenario, on the big picture, did this have a true impact for you?
I think there were two. I mean, so the answer to the question is probably no. In the grand scheme of things, the impact was limited. But I think there were two things. One, I'll talk about the first. The first and most obvious on the military side, there was disruptions of lines of supply.
Mhm.
There was a distraction against actual Confederate units. So the line of supply, there was a larger effort outside of just this county where things like burning, destroying Confederate bridges or bridges used by the Confederates for supply. So that was happening quite a bit to disrupt the lines of supply.
Also a logistical
And then
situation that it was already critical for the Confederates.
exactly, yeah. So that was one piece, and then of course that wasn't their goal. Their goal was really just generally to be guerrillas fighting for their freedom in this their homeland, right? But the impact of that was that all of the surrounding sort of Confederate units would occasionally be called in to go into the county and put down some of the guerrilla warfare. And so none of the Confederate units were really ever stationed there for a long period of time. So it didn't have a sustained impact, but it did definitely serve as a diversion, as a distraction. And when I show the game here in a moment, you'll get a sense of all the different surrounding areas that were impacted by the distraction. So I'll mention that first, and then I'll pause for a second, and I'll come back and mention the other.
Ok, l'impatto generale assoluto totale chiaramente fu limitato, anche perché non era l'obiettivo di queste persone, di questi lealisti, non era l'obiettivo dobbiamo adesso da soli cambiare la guerra, semplicemente cambiavano per dire la nostra contea non vogliamo questa storia della secessione, non vogliamo avere niente a che fare. Però è chiaro che un impatto ce l'ha avuto anche nella memoria dei luoghi e anche comunque un certo impatto militare su questa situazione logistica che era già critica per i confederati. Stiamo parlando del 63, del 64, quando ormai la situazione comincia a precipitare per la confederazione. E certo, chiaramente in un teatro così importante, anche se l'impatto è limitato, comunque si fa sentire. Please go on.
And then the other one I would mention is there was obviously a huge impact from a sort of political or propaganda perspective, because if you can imagine, if you're in the Union, if you're in the North and you see Union aligned guerrillas rising up against the Confederates, that's a huge propaganda win. It was in lots of newspapers. The story was definitely being told, and I think that that's a hard thing to quantify, like in terms of the impact it has. But certainly for things like morale, for things like being able to, if you're a politician in the North, leverage that as a reason to show how you're on the right side of this conflict.
It is a big why we fight motive, ok?
Right.
Ovviamente l'impatto qual è? Però l'impatto maggiore lì sì che si sente, anche se è difficile da quantificare, l'impatto sulla società, la propaganda, il fatto che queste storie girano nel nord. Ehi, ci sono dei sudisti che si stanno ribellando contro la Confederazione. È una cosa importantissima se a livello politico devi continuare a dare una spinta alla guerra. Ok, how all this translates into game terms?
All right, so let's change. I'll change over to, let's see here. So obviously the standard, this is a prototype. Let me see.
Ok, not the final art, not the final production, we all know that.
Right.
Ovviamente è un prototipo, non è la grafica finale, lo sapete già, le solite cose, però ci dà un'idea di come funziona.
So,
ok, here we are.
Okay, so first thing I will say is that we talked a little bit at the beginning about my entrance into war games, and the very first war game I played was A Few Acres of Snow.
Oh, fantastic!
So I will say up front that the game mechanics inspiration for this came directly from A Few Acres of Snow, and if you're familiar with it or many of the other games that have, there's not that many games that have been derived from it. From a non-historic perspective, you've got...
I remember Ends in the Sea, the one that's getting a new edition by Phalanx. Just one second. Uno è, sto dicendo, uno a cui è molto debitore è Pochi acri di neve di Martin Wallace. Quindi chiaramente parliamo di quel tipo di gioco. In Italian is pochi acri di neve, so few acres of snow, but we all know that because also it was one of the very first historical games in the modern period, in the latest period, that was actually localized even in Italian. So there is an Italian version, and it is very well known and very much played here in Italy because it is a great game. Absolutely.
Yes. Yes, it's one of my favorites. And so I bring that up, one, because it has continued to serve as an inspiration to me throughout the time, through all my designs. But you'll see some direct inspiration in the way some of the mechanisms of this game. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Okay.
So the first thing I'll do to kind of orient everyone to the game is just to talk about the sort of colors that I'm using here in the prototype. So anything that's blue is people from, I call it the Scott County faction, right? Because it's not really a Union faction.
They're
really, it
not
was the
regular
people
troops.
from this.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. And then gray is the combination of actual Confederate military and the Confederate aligned guerrillas. And there was a small number of guerrillas that were from this county. Most of the guerrillas that were fighting on this side were from neighboring counties that were in here. And so what you'll see is this is a map of primarily of the county, but the locations around it, these gray circles, those are all cities that are outside of the county where Confederate units were garrisoned. And in every one of these instances, Confederate units would come into the county to put down some of their guerrilla warfare. And so this goes back to, what I mentioned before in terms of distracting Confederate operations.
Just a second, ovviamente vediamo in blu non sono dei regolari, sono i lealisti e l'Unione. In grigio sono un mix di guerriglia, secessionisti e di regolari, dove vedete questi circoletti grigi sono le città da cui arrivano le truppe sudiste per reprimere questa insurrezione. Those are actually counterinsurrection dynamics because you have centers which provide regular or counterinsurgency troops of various kinds, and then they get to those places.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's difficult to tell on this map because this is just my prototype map, but the terrain for this game is extremely important because, remember, we're talking about a very mountainous area, a very heavily wooded area with almost no real roads to support major troop movement. And that plays a very important part of the game. So you can see there's road networks here. There's water connections, which are almost always creeks. And then there are trails. And really these trails, most of them are taken from Native American trails that continued, their use. But when we talk about trails, we're talking about very small, seldom traveled footpaths.
But also very ancient. Vedete tutte le linee di comunicazione, il terreno è molto importante, sono strade, ma quelli che sono con i puntini, allora quelli blu sono fiumi ovviamente, quelli con i puntini sono addirittura sentieri utilizzati dalle nazioni native. Okay?
So we'll talk a little bit about the mechanisms in the game. So it is a deck building game.
Deck building.
And so you're going to use hand management. Each player is going to have a hand of 5 cards, and the cards are of one of 2 types, generally speaking. They are a location card, so a card that's tied to a specific location. So, for example, this card is tied to this location, or a unit card, meaning it's a military card and it has a military strength to it. So all cards are one of those 2 types.
Okay. Carte di 2 tipi, o risorse o carte militari. All right.
Okay, and so let's take, for example, we'll start with the starting deck for the Scott County people. So this is their starting deck, and I'm just going to give an example of a turn of an action you might do to give a sense of what a turn might be.
All right.
And so here we have an example of those same 2 types of cards, a location card and a unit card. This card ties back to this location. And the blue token here means that the Scott County people have presence in that location. They have known to have presence. There's no sense in this game of a unit of physical military marker representing an active people there. That's part of the guerrilla warfare conflict concept here. Instead, it's just an abstract representation of presence by one side or the other in a location.
All right. Quindi sono presenze anche non specifiche su un punto, ma ovviamente parliamo di guerriglia, quindi anche quando utilizziamo delle carte locazione sono appunto delle risorse, delle possibilità di movimento in una certa posizione. E poi ci sono le carte unità che sono quelle del combattimento.
And so in this example, actually, I'll remove this piece for just a moment. Let's say I don't have presence here already. If I wanted to go here and occupy this location, the first thing you do when you're taking an action from any location is you play the location you're coming from. So if I want to occupy this, I need to come from Buffalo Creek. So the first thing I would do is play this card. And then if I want to take control or be present in this location, I need to play a unit card that has a person on it.
It is a combination of the two cards. Okay.
That's right. And then the last piece I need to do is the star on this location is the victory point it's worth. And typically what you'll see is the more important a location is, the more victory points it's worth. So in this case, this location is only worth 1. And so the food, and we can talk about why the food is the resource in the game, but food is the resource you spend in a way you might spend money or something else in another game. And so to take control of a location, you have to spend food equal to the victory points.
And so in this case, me a bit like supply lines of the American Revolution. You need food to move people around, essentially. You know, the game about by Amabel Holland. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Quindi
so in this case,
quindi per andare in un posto dovete giocare la carta da dove partite, dal posto dove partite. Questo è proprio come pochi acri di neve. E poi anche una carta di unità per crearla, ma spendere cibo. You need to have a logistical network set up.
Well, actually, and remind me, let's talk a little bit about the importance of supply as it pertains to the Confederates, right? And that's, again, a very important representation of the guerrilla conflict in this game. So in this example, we've expanded from Buffalo Creek into Buffalo. We played the card and we spent the food. That allows us to be present there. Now, if in this example I was not already present there, this card, the card that corresponds to Buffalo, would have been in the supply. Nobody would have had it. As soon as I become present there, I take the card and I put it into my deck. So now I can expand from that location, right?
Una volta che conquisto una locazione, come pochi acri di neve, mi prendo la carta di quella locazione. So this location becomes usable in my own maneuvers because I'm there. So it can be activated as a starting point.
That's exactly right. And so that's the most fundamental part of the game is expanding a new location, being present. That gives you the ability to act from that location.
You have control of the terrain.
And so I'll go ahead and talk about why I chose food as the resource for the game. And it's pretty clear, as you can imagine, when you have sustained military operations in a single region like this, what it served to do, and this was from both sides, is it basically just ravaged the food supply of the area. Every farmer's fields were essentially taken over by both sides and completely ravaged. And actually, what's interesting about this is the best records we have about the conflict from this region is from the claims after the war by people wanting restitution because of the damage caused to their farms.
David, we have Danielle here in the chat. This is a situation very similar to the 30 Years' War. I'm thinking about von Wallenstein's logistical problems. At the end, he had too big of an army and he had to move to other countries just to sustain that army. Qui il motore di tutto è il cibo. perché tutte queste persone devono mangiare per fare cose e una delle caratteristiche principali di questa campagna è il fatto che i campi venissero costantemente razziati da tutte le parti. So this was a great devastation for all those involved.
Right, right. And so the game will play out until you've run out of food. That this food supply here, this different colored, represents as you play through the game until that point when the last one is taken. That triggers the end game, and then you have 10 more food that while you're playing. So when this triggers the end game. So if I take the last food on my turn, starting the next turn, we're going to start checking to see if at the beginning of your turn you're winning in victory points, you win the game.
Oh, so this supply
so
is
it doesn't
limited.
end immediately.
Yeah, okay, right.
The supply is limited, and it doesn't. It's not an immediate victory. So if I'm winning, let's say this was the score, and I take the last food, and I'm blue, then gray will check on its turn, and if it was winning, they would win the game. Otherwise, they have a chance to catch up, and we continue back and forth until at the beginning of your turn, you're winning. And at that point, that's how you decide who wins. If you run through this dark colored food and the game is still not over because it's been going back and forth and nobody's winning at the beginning of their turn, the game will end in a draw.
Okay.
So that's how you check for victory.
Il cibo è così importante che, and this is the first time I've seen it, la prima volta che l'ho visto, la parte logistica è il clock, è l'orologio del gioco. Finisce il cibo che è una risorsa limitata e da quel punto comincia l'endgame, comincia a controllarsi le condizioni di vittoria, fino a quegli ultimi 10 più scuri che sono proprio l'ultimissima riserva. This is very important because we have never I don't know if I've ever seen a limited supply of food in a logistics game. And I've never seen, sure, having food and not just a set amount of turns as the clock of a game.
Right. Yeah, and so you can absolutely well you will see as you're playing the game if you're on the losing side, you're going to have to start making some very difficult decisions about, well, how do I get ahead? I need to be using food, but I can't use the food as much as I would like to because it's running the clock out. And so it's a very difficult, situation to be in. What you'll see is this is the starting score at the beginning of the game because the Scott County people are controlling, they have presence in most of the counties. So they start the game with 11 victory points. And as you can imagine, as the Confederates establish themselves and start moving in, that will change very quickly.
La track dei punti vittoria all'inizio gli alisti hanno 11 perché controllano questi, ma naturalmente poi I see that 20, so that when the loyalists get to 20, this is an end game condition, I think.
So when either side can get to 20, it's an alternate victory condition, and really what it means, because for the most part, there's only a set amount of victory points in the game because you either do or you don't possess a location. And so if either side ever gets to 20, that means that they're really way ahead of the other side.
Raggiungere 20 è una condizione di vittoria, ovviamente, perché a quel punto avete il controllo di tutta la contea. Altrimenti si va alla durata, il cibo, e poi si vede chi sta sopra quando finisce il cibo. Yeah.
And so one thing, to some degree, there is a representation of constrained operations because you have to be present in a location to operate from it, right? So that's just built into the game automatically. All of the Scott County locations are like that. There is no further concept of supply lines. They can operate from any location as long as they're present there. So for example, this location, while remote, can operate as long as you're playing the card. So that's fine.
Okay. Quindi...
Now, on the Confederate side, there are units that can also do the same. So, for example, this was essentially a mercenary rebel that fought for the Confederates.
And so
if you're using that card, it's essentially independent. And so if you're using some card like that where it's a guerrilla, they can, as long as you're using that card, they can operate from any location.
Mhm.
However, if you're using an actual Confederate military unit, supply becomes much more important. There's a couple of
Okay.
things that are happening. So what you'll see first is this symbology here, this line with the
Mm.
circles around it. That's telling you this is an actual Confederate military unit, and it needs to trace supply back to its
Oh
home
wow.
location,
Oh
right?
wow.
And it can only operate on roads because, like I said, you're not moving a regiment along a creek, and you're not moving a regiment along a
Ok,
footpath, right? So in this case, it
ok.
needs to stay on the road.
Ok, allora una cosa fondamentale. Allora, la guerriglia naturalmente si sostiene da tutte le parti e ha anche alcune unità dei sudisti che sono un po' dei mercenari indipendenti, ma le unità regolari, vedete, il 43esimo Alabama, I think, il 43esimo reggimento di fanteria dell'Alabama ha una sua base di operazione, Wartburg, si può muovere solo sulle strade perché non lo muovete un reggimento su di un torrente, non è la guerra franco-indiana, e ha bisogno di essere collegato alla sua base di operazioni. This is very asymmetrical.
Oh yes, yes, extremely asymmetric, extremely. And so one thing that's really great about this is let me just show you how the
Yeah.
Confederates build up their regular forces. So in
Mhm.
their starting deck, they do not start with any regular Confederate army forces at all.
Mhm.
The only thing they start with from units are the secessionists that were from the county, so
Okay.
guerrillas aligned to them.
Mhm.
But they can play a location card tied to the location where those units came from, and that gives them the ability to buy these cards and add them to their deck. And so what you'll see is at the bottom of these
Ah,
cards, it tells
okay.
you if if you play this card and this amount of food, and so you can see they're very expensive.
You get
You
this
can add
regiment.
these cards. Right. Now what that means is if you're the Scott County player, if you're the blue player, you've just been signaled that the Confederates are
Oh.
preparing themselves for an attack, right? Because
Oh.
they've now added this to their discards. And so you have the time it takes for that card to get through the discard,
Yeah, you have a
shuffled into the deck
cycle. Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
come, right?
Allora, come si
And so now you
arruolano?
know
Come
so
si
you know it's coming.
yeah, you know it's coming. Come si arruolano unità regolari per il sudista? Ok, voi lo dovete pagare con la carta e tutto quanto le mettete, ma vengono messe nel ciclo del deck building e quindi il giocatore della guerriglia della Scott County sa che stanno arrivando, ci vorrà un po' di tempo e quindi gli state dicendo, beh, attaccheremo da qui con queste unità quando arrivano e quindi so the guerrilla is more agile. It can adapt.
Hmm.
It has a signal.
Yes. Yep. And then the other thing that will restrain them is once we've shuffled through the deck and we've drawn
Mm,
this unit card, it still has to trace its supply back to Wartburg
yeah.
anytime it takes any action. So if you want to use this to expand into Brimstone Creek or New River, if you want to attack here or
Hmm.
expand here, you'll need to play the Wartburg card, and then you'll need to play this unit card, and it has to follow those roads. So that's
Mm.
fine. It can do that. It can expand. So let's say if it expands here, that's fine. You would just then play those cards and put them back in your discard.
Yeah.
However, remember the goal of these Confederate units. They're not going to establish a permanent presence in the county. They're going to put down the rebellion, put down the guerrillas. So if the Confederates ever use these cards to successfully attack a Union
Hmm.
uh,
For
presence, if they attack and they're successful, you can see after the combat power for this card, it has a little X. That means it's permanently removed from the game
oh,
because it's done its job,
okay.
right?
They're
It's gone in and
guys.
it's put down the rebellion,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
E quindi appunto quando vengono utilizzate le carte dei regolari alcune vengono poi scartate e tolte dal gioco perché hanno fatto il loro lavoro, beh, e perché il loro lavoro appunto è quello di eliminare la guerriglia, non semplicemente di recuperare il territorio. So how does combat work?
Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about this. So I just mentioned, in this example, they would play. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to build my hand
Mhm.
with 5 cards. We'll just say that these are the 5 cards I have in my hand for the Confederates. And a reminder, so I have Somerset and Jacksboro. These are locations. So Somerset is up here. and Jacksboro's over here.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if this was my hand, I could not play this card with these because it can't trace supply back to these locations. It has to go back to Wartburg.
Okay.
So I'm just going to keep these location cards for a moment. So I want this, in this situation, let's say my goal is to attack from Wartburg into New River. I can play either of these cards because they can both trace back to Wartburg. And so if I'm the Confederate player, I'm going to put down the Wartburg card and I'm going to announce I'm attacking from Wartburg to New River.
Okay.
I will play the location card, and then I can take either of these two, and I'm going to play it face down. I'm not revealing the strength I'm playing with.
Okay. So there
there is fog of war, exactly. And so now the Scott County player looks at their hand, and so I'll just make a quick hand of cards. So let's say that this was their hand. Now, once you've played the game and you've learned the cards, you can know quite a bit. You can know what's the possible strength that your opponent has, those types of things. But there's still quite a bit of fog of war based.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, but the defender can always play up to 2 cards. They can play 1 unit card, and they can play the location that matches the place that's being attacked. So in this case, I could play New River, and I could play one unit card. So I'm just going to get the New River card out for this example. So the defender can play either of those 2 cards. You play them one at a time face down. So let's say I'm going to play New River face down. And then we come back, and the Confederate player can choose to play up to 3, and I'll describe in what situation you might not be able to. But in this case, I could play up to 3. I'm fairly confident I can beat the Scott County player, so I choose not to do that. I choose to pass. And then the Scott County player could play their other card, and then you reveal them. Okay. So in this case, you're comparing the attacker has the gun symbols here. The defender uses the shield symbols here.
Okay.
And then the gun can be attack or defend. So in this case, it's 1 plus 1 is 2. I'll come back to this bottom here in a second. So it's 1 plus 1 is 2. And the attacker had 3, so they win.
Ok.
So that's combat.
Ok.
Purely deterministic.
Yeah. Praticamente il combattimento si giocano le carte delle locazioni che noi creiamo e poi a carte coperte si vede quanto investiamo, cerchiamo di capire. È chiaro che se investiamo molto, spendiamo molto, quindi dove mi conviene, quanto mi conviene investire per la difesa e quanto per l'attacco. Il combattimento è molto deterministico, è un gioco, it's a bluffing game, I think. Is more or less
there is a bit of bluffing.
Yeah.
There is and there's not only is it a bit of bluffing, the Scott County players really need to use their flexibility and the supply lines of the Confederates against them with the bluffing, and they're not always trying to necessarily win a fight. And so I'm going to give you an example. So in this example, I'll just finish this up real quick. So the Confederates win, so they remove a token from this location. They get to place a token. You would modify the victory points immediately, so the Union would lose 2, the Confederates would go up 2, and that would be it. Now, again, you'd have to pay the food to take this over, etc. But you get the idea. Now, I want to talk about really briefly the very difficult position the Confederate army can be in from the asymmetric attacks. So let's say in this example, the Scott County has occupied this location and they attack across this creek. If this was the situation, the Confederate player, if they lose this location, they're going to lose their supply line.
Okay, they're isolated.
And so they're isolated. And so they really, 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 really want to defend this location. So what the Scott County player can do is just make an attack with one single weak card, but because it's face down, it's a bluff. you're forcing the Confederate player to defend it. And oftentimes what they'll have to do is defend it with one of their strong cards, which pulls it out of their hand.
Mhm.
And then they start their turn. They don't draw up after they defend. So
Oh,
now they're down this strong card. So you're not really even trying to win the fight. You're just trying to pull the powerful cards out of
yeah.
their hand so that they can't turn around and use that card to
Let
attack
me
with.
explain that because it's very important.
Yes.
Vedete, questo attacco da Princeton, l'unionista può fare un attacco anche molto debole, ma siccome il confederato deve assolutamente difendere Princeton, perché sennò perde anche Huntsville, perché sennò è isolato, non ha più rifornimento, perché l'unionista lo fa? Lo attacca anche con poco, tanto è un bluff, perché così il confederato dovrà spendere quella carta molto forte per difendere Princeton e non ce l'avrà più. Quindi l'unionista sa che non andrà a vincere quella battaglia, ma la sta minacciando. The Union player is just threatening the supply lines, and this is enough to get people in panic. The average
Yes.
military person to be in panic and expend all their resources just to defend the supply lines.
Right. That's right. So, so there's a lot more, obviously, detail and texture and stuff to the combat. One thing I see there's a question with your location matching unit card, either player, about some of the other. So with locations, we'll use our example as you don't card to the other thing you can do actions here. So one thing that you can is to play it food.
Ok.
So in this place, you could play it and you get one food. Of course, we know that food is the engine in the game. That's very straightforward. This symbol here just means that you can move from the location. So it's how you move, it's how you attack.
Before. Yeah.
As we did before. This symbol here, it's a little cube with a plus. That is how you improve a location. And that's how you unlock the bottom of the card, which is a better version. And so what you do is you play this card, you pay an amount of food equal to the victory points of the location. So in this case, it's 2 food. And then if this had been the situation, you'd put another cube on it, you'd score another victory point, and now you get to use the bottom of the card. Okay? Almost always, improving a location is something only the Scott County people can do because you're unlocking those noteworthy historical people that were from those locations. And these are all the actual historical people.
A strong presence in the area. Yeah. Ok,
That's right. That's right.
Very quickly. Come vedete le carte hanno anche un sopra e un sotto. Il sotto voi lo sbloccate spendendo risorse e quindi sbloccando di una locazione delle cose, le capacità particolari. Quindi sopra vedete New River e quella generica, sotto i Reed Brothers, che sono dei personaggi che agivano da New River, e a questo punto per esempio i Reed Brothers lì avete 2 di difesa, 2 scudi anziché 1, e quindi la state migliorando. Essentially you are improving your positions, you are investing to improve your positions.
That's right. That's right. And what you'll notice is as you improved it, it's worth, first of all, it's worth more victory points, but secondly, you've actually improved the defense there also.
Okay, you're fortifying it.
And that's right. That's right. And so, and I already briefly covered this when I talked about an example earlier, but I'll cover it in just a little bit more detail now. So what you'll see is any of the cards that are on the board, that start on the board, like these cards, that means that these are unit cards that you can add to your deck by playing the location and essentially recruiting those units into your deck.
Okay.
And so in this case, you would play Huntsville, and it's got a little blue card, plus card. And what it's saying is you can take these cards and add them to your deck, again, by paying the food. And so that's how you're adding new units to your deck.
Le unità le aggiungete giocando la carta che ha le variazioni. Tra le variazioni c'è il reclutamento. Pagate il cibo, giocate Huntsville e avete la on guard di Huntsville pagando il cibo della on guard. Quindi state reclutando. Un'altra delle azioni che potete fare, trovate tutto sulle carte. It's nice that you have everything on the cards, so it's very intuitive. It's a very intuitive interface.
Right.
You always know what you can or you can't do in a given location.
That's right. Yeah. And if you look at the locations on the board, it's also a little quick reference for what's possible on those cards. So you know the totality of what's available to you.
Yeah.
That's really, I mean, that's sort of a high level version. There's a few other little small bits, like these two cards are stacked. And the reason for that is once you've added this card, you can then take it and upgrade to a better version of the card. So you'd actually remove this card from the game and get this better version.
You're getting a
so there's a lot of little...
David, you're getting compliments already from the prototype version, because this is very... Simone Rastelli is telling, well, that is not bad, very, very readable. And you're already telling us some small secrets, some small details that we will get to discover when we play many times these games. Questo gioco, come vedete, è molto semplice, è un primo livello che abbiamo visto proprio il livello base, ma giocandolo trovate per esempio carte sotto altre carte, l'importanza di certe posizioni, tante cose che verranno giocandolo più volte. This is what I like about apparently simple games, that the more you play them, the more layers and levels and sub-levels you discover, and then you get to see where are the choke points, what are the small secrets here and there, and the small combinations. It's a bit a puzzle-like experience. Very nice.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I think, I mean, that's pretty much it. I'll mention one last thing, and this will be the final thing, unless there's a question. But I mentioned before, if you successfully use the Confederates to attack, this little X means that it's permanently removed from the game. The other thing that you'll see some of the units have, there's one unit on the Scott County side, and then there's some on the Confederate side. It's this little card with an arrow, and what that means is these were militias that are guerrillas that were not part of the local guerrillas. So even this guy, who he was a guerrilla leader, but outside of the county, if you recruit this card at the bottom and you'll take it into your deck, if you use it, it goes back to this location. And so it's simulating that he's coming in and then he's leaving and he's coming back.
Ecco, questa è una cosa interessante. Prima avete visto quell'icona con la X, significa che se giocate quella carta, ovviamente l'avete giocata e quindi viene rimossa dal gioco, come nei card driven. Ma vedete questa con la freccetta, cos'è? Siccome sono unità esterne che vanno e vengono, la giocate e poi quando l'avete giocata non la scartate, la ripiazzate sulla mappa e dovete riattivarla una seconda volta. You have to pay that again and again and again to use it.
That's right.
Great.
Yeah.
Se ci sono domande, if you have questions, questo più o meno è fondamentalmente il gioco. Ok, non mi pare. I don't think there are. Oh, I have a question. And that is the classical question. When is it going out? When it is going to be published?
Oh, that's a good question.
Quando esce? Quando esce?
So I mentioned this morning when we talked briefly, but so the design is done. The design is complete. Trevor, I don't know if I mentioned this as we spoke today or not. So this is a co-design with my often co-design partner, Trevor Benjamin.
Trevor.
So just a quick recap of that. So I started working on this. I did the historical research and came up with sort of a design concept. And I presented that to Trevor, and so he was kind enough to say, he wanted to work on it with me, and so we've worked on the design together. When the two of us work together, it makes it's a really good partnership because we're able to do a lot of development work ourselves on it. So while we did do some external play testing, we know that we've put a lot of time into it, and so we're happy with the design now. It's being published by Flying Pig. It does have an artist, but he's not started on it yet. And so it will be, it'll be that timeline. I think Flying Pig's goal is to get it onto crowdfunding, like middle or sort of like maybe the fall time frame, middle of the year to the fall.
Ok, quindi dovrebbe uscire più o meno a metà dell'anno autunno. We are all hoping that international situation does not get us to a higher price, but we hope. Speriamo che la situazione internazionale non alzi troppo il prezzo, perché è veramente interessante. I can easily see that as being a sandbox game, a system that can be adapted to various different historical situations, like you did with Undaunted, e ovviamente un sistema che può essere anche adattato ad altre situazioni storiche e appunto ha citato anche Trevor Benjamin, che è il suo coautore storico, diciamo. Oh, Randolph Carter is asking if you are going to Kickstarter or GameFound or other crowdfunding, se sarà su Kickstarter, GameFound o altre piattaforme di crowdfunding.
Yeah, it'll be Flying Pig's decision. I think they mostly use Kickstarter.
Yeah, quindi sì, sarà su Kickstarter per la Flying Pig. We all hope that they get an EU-friendly shipment. Yeah, and also Randolph Carter is hoping to. But after a while, in Europe, they come to in retail, so we should wait. But if there is a EU-friendly option, I think that this is a game to get, because it is a very, very promising system. A few years ago, I was with Volko Ronchi at a play that was in Modena, and I showed him not Hold the Line, Horse and Musket by Sean Chick, and they said, okay, this is a great tactical sandbox. I'd like to see a more operational sandbox. I think this system with some adaptation could be what Folco was looking at. Tempo fa alla Play, parlando con Folco, mi diceva, gli avevo fatto vedere Horse and Musket e lui mi ha detto bellissimo sandbox tattico, chissà se un giorno si riuscirà a fare un sandbox operazionale. Beh, un qualcosina del genere. You have a very specific question, David. In which phase do contacts for localization with non-US publishers happen in your experience? I don't know if you have these experience. Yeah, with General Holders, you had this. You had localized, and also Undaunted.
Yeah, it depends on the publisher. So some publishers, before a game is even released, will look for those partnerships. And I think publishers generally have done a better job of being proactive, but it depends on the publisher, it depends on the game. But for most of the publishers I work with now, they either already have those partnerships in place, or they do the work during that sort of like final development phase. As the art's complete and stuff, they'll get those partnerships in place.
Ok, quindi solitamente nella fase finale che avvengono gli accordi per la localizzazione, ma ovviamente dipende dagli editori. So David, thank you very much. You really brought us a great title, very promising title, and thank you very much for this preview. We are always interested in these kind of historical games, and also about these alternative topics, and also about these alternative point of views about very well-known historical events. Siamo sempre interessati a questi giochi storici diversi, ma anche che ci danno una prospettiva diversa su eventi storici. Thank you for having been here, David. I think that...
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and it's been a real pleasure and an honor. Just remember that Undaunted is one of the most frequently played war games here in Italy, and we are so happy. Also, it had a good localization, so this and good translation. This really helps it, and it is very. I consider that title one of our strategic assets in diffusing in the diffusion of historical gaming. Grazie a David per essere stato con noi. Undaunted è conosciutissimo qua in Italia. And also General Holders come anche General Holders, sono giochi che sono assolutamente fondamentali. Per tutti, appuntamento alle ore 18, Clio Ludo Pub per la conclusione della giornata e per gli ultimi saluti di questa splendida giornata che è stata questa seconda Virtual Ludo Storicon. Thank you. We will be meeting in more or less at 18:00 here in 20 minutes or so in the Clio Ludo Pub room for the final salutations and the conclusions of this great day. And thanks for your great contribution to the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.